Good morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name is Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, and today I am going to be showing you about a deck I played this weekend. Now, some of you might look at this video and go, hang on a second, this deck isn't very good. Fair enough. What I will tell you is I played this at an expanded regional championship at the weekend. I went undefeated in Swiss and I lost in top 8 to a combination of my deck being too slow to win a proper best of 3 series, drawing dead in game 1, and then losing the coin flip to decide the game at the end. These things happen. The point is, it's a viable deck. Now, I need to give a huge shout out to Omnipoke and specifically Joe Bernard, very good friend of mine who gave me the idea for this deck, and I told him he was an idiot until we talked about it a lot and realised it was actually really good, and he did principally provide me with the list. It is his list and his idea, but I like to think I contributed by talking to him a lot and suggesting a few changes. But make no mistake, Joe Bernard deserves an awful lot, nay, most of the credit for this deck. But people liked my Greninja video and other videos I've done in this manner, my Greninja video being the most popular one I've done for a long time, so I thought I'd show you Regirock in this kind of video. Yes, I will do a video showing you my deck list at some point, but this is a deck that takes explaining and not just giving you a list. So, settle down, grab yourself a nice cold beverage, and let's go. Now, we're focusing on expanded, but obviously we will have a chat about standard as we go through. Regirock. Now, Regirock was actually a promo card. It was released as one of those cards where for somewhere around $10 or 10 quid in the UK, maybe a little bit more in the US, you get free boosters, a coin, and a promo card. And one of these promos was Regirock. And at first glance, it looks terrible. 110 HP, not particularly good. And the first attack is completely and utterly useless. All grab 2 stadiums from the discard. Yeah, I didn't use that at the weekend, not once, not in many, many games. And the second attack, 80 damage for 4 energy. Oh, but if you can flip heads, 120 for 4 energy. You know what? In black and white base set, that's many sets ago, Reshiram and Zekrom were doing 120 for 3 energy. It's not a good attack, and it's a low HP Pokemon. So why do we play it? Because it's got the ancient trait Omega Barrier. And this says essentially that if your opponent plays a trainer card, except for tools or stadiums, it has no effect on Regirock. Now, as a ruling query, the card is still played. So I've got a Regirock on the bench. My opponent plays a Lysander to try and drag him into the active. Nothing happens, but my opponent has still played the Lysander, they have still used their supporter for the turn, and that can be very annoying and frustrating for them. Now, Regirock is not the only Pokemon that's had this ancient trait. Macargo had it, but he's a stage 1 and nobody loves him, plus he's not fighting type and that's going to become relevant. And Primal Groudon had this ancient trait, and this did see play. Groudon has been a deck that has seen at least a lot of play in the past. So why is Regirock so good? Because he's a basic and he's a fighting type. I.e., that Omega Barrier ancient trait is always there. And as it stands, there is no way to get rid of ancient traits. They are always ready to go, which is very, very good. So, let's start off looking at the kind of things that this ancient trait will stop. First of all, the most annoying thing in the format, or at least an expanded format, Hypnotoxic Laser. Doesn't poison Regirock, doesn't put him to sleep even if you flip heads. It does nothing because it can't affect Regirock. That's pretty cool. Also, we've talked about Lysander and Energy Denial. Anything which gets rid of energy. Think Crushing Hammer, think Team Flare Grunt, think Enhanced Hammer. All those cards that would get rid of energy on a 4 energy Pokemon like Regirock, who is going to be relying on strong energy, which is a special energy. It's just not good enough. However, because your opponent can just get rid of so much energy. Regirock, on the other hand, you can't get rid of the energy, and that's pretty gosh darn good. Okay, so we can't be Lysandered, you can't get rid of the energy, Hypnotoxic Laser doesn't do anything. We're still talking about a Pokemon doing 120 damage for 4 energy. What makes him good? And the answer is Focus Sash. Now, the fact that Regirock is a fighting Pokemon means he can take advantage of Focus Sash. And Focus Sash is a tool that you attach to one of your fighting Pokemon, and if they would be one-hit KO'd, i.e. if they've got full health and would be KO'd, They go down to 10 HP remaining, and the Focus Sash carries on. That's pretty gosh darn good, but that is only part of the story, because then you're left there with a 10 HP Regirock that you have put 4 energy on. Well, then he's just going to get KO'd next turn, so what do? Well, here's where it gets interesting, because in the expanded format we have Ace Trainers, and one of the Ace Trainers we have is Scramble Switch. So what you do is you have a Regirock and you hit for 80 damage, 120 if you can hit heads on a coin flip. But let's not forget you've got cards like Strong Energy, which add 20 damage, and you can play Fighting Stadium that adds 20 damage to EXs. So you can build this up to actually do a fair amount of damage. It just takes a while. Regirock gets hit, Focus Sash goes away, he's down to 10 HP, you then play Scramble Switch. New Regirock comes into the active. It's basically a switch, but you can attach as much energy as you like from the old active to the new active. So benched Regirock comes into the active, takes all 4 energy, you put a new Focus Sash on that Regirock, and now all of a sudden you've got a fresh Regirock with 4 energy ready to go, and your opponent is not taking a prize next turn. And you might be thinking, well, hang on a second, yeah, Scramble Switch is quite good, but it's a once-a-game kind of thing. Well, it's not a once-a-game kind of thing, ladies and gentlemen. It is a thrice-a-game kind of thing, because we now have the card Puzzle of Time. And if you play 2 Puzzle of Time at one go, you can take any 2 cards from your discard and put them into your hand. Which means if you can play double Puzzle of Time twice, you can play 3 Scramble Switches in a single game. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty gosh darn good. Now, as a couple of ruling queries, just so we're going, if your opponent plays Escape Rope and Regirock is in the active, it does nothing, it affects Regirock. But if you've got, let's say, a Garchomp in the active and a Regirock on the bench and only a Regirock, then Escape Rope will force Regirock into the active. Reason is, it affects Garchomp, not Regirock. In terms of Puzzle of Time, you cannot play 2 Puzzle of Time and immediately grab one of them back with Scramble Switch to use it 3 times. But if you've got a puzzle, say you've had to use 1 Puzzle of Time early, then you can use 2 Puzzle of Time to grab Scramble Switch and the one that's already in the discard, so that you can then later draw your 4th Puzzle of Time and you've got 1 in your hand and you can reuse Scramble Switch again. So you can use 1 Puzzle of Time or discard it early game and still use 3 Scramble Switch in one game. And then, of course, once you Scramble Switch, you're not going to be able to do this every turn. So what you can do is you can pop Regirock back to the bench, stall for a couple of turns while you try and heal him or build up another Regirock. Because remember, ladies and gentlemen, when Regirock goes to the bench, he cannot be brought into the active with something like Lysander or Pokemon Catcher. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the basic theory of the Regirock deck. You build him up on the bench, you attach Focus Sash, when he loses the Focus Sash, you Scramble Switch in a new Regirock, and you use Puzzle of Time to reuse those Scramble Switches as much as you like. And it is a fun thing to do. As a quick side note, in terms of stalling, how do you stall? Well, there's 3 cards which I think are pretty gosh darn good while you stall. Number 1, Robo Substitute. It's an item card, you put it in the active, your opponent KOs it, they don't take a prize, you've just bought yourself a turn. Number 2, Wobbuffet. He sits in the active, stops your opponent using abilities. Now, you're not playing any Shame in EX in this deck, because this is a prize denial deck. You are trying to stop your opponent taking prizes. Putting 110 HP 2 prize Pokemon on the bench is not the way to do that. So you put Wobbuffet active, you have no abilities, it doesn't affect you, but it can really slow down your opponent, while they can't do things like playing a Shaman to draw extra cards. And let's not forget that you could often play a Lysander to bring a different Pokemon in the active so that Wobbuffet is no longer active and no longer blocks abilities, but you're going to have Regirocks on the bench that cannot be Lysandered into the active, so Wobbuffet can really slow them down. The other card I really like for stalling, and unfortunately this takes a deck from a very cheap deck to a potentially very expensive deck, Tropical Beach. You're going to have turn after turn of just attaching an energy and passing with a Robo-Sub or a Wobbuffet active. Tropical Beach allows you to draw until you've got 7 cards in your hand and end your turn. gets your deck rolling a little bit faster. So, got a few things to discuss. Now, I've told you the basic theory of the deck and how it works. Regirock on the bench, attach energy, stall behind Wobbuffet and Robo-Sub while you build up and then try and stream Focus Sash Regis. By the way, I should point out, if you get to mid-game and you have no fresh Focus Sash Regi, then you just go to the bench and put a Wobbuffet or a Robo-Sub active and just stall for a little while. But there are some questions to answer. Number one, how does your opponent try and break Focus Sash? Well, there are a few ways to do it. Number one, they can play a Hypnotoxic Laser so that you go down to 10 HP remaining, the poison damage from Laser kicks in, and all of a sudden you have no Focus Sash and you get KO'd. Works against most fighting Pokemon, does not work against Regirock because Omega Barrier stops Hypnotoxic Laser. The other thing your opponent would do is try and get rid of the Focus Sash using Startling Megaphone or Tool Scrapper or Zorosic, none of which can affect Regirock, so they do not get rid of the Focus Sash. And this is what makes it so powerful. Most decks rely on things like Megaphone, Zorosic or Laser. That is how they would get around Focus Sash. As we'll talk about at the end, there are an awful lot of decks that just cannot break Focus Sash. Now, there are a couple ways to do it. I suppose the way to put it is the less civilized way, the less refined way, is just 2-hit KO. Do a bunch of damage, and then just hit the Regirock again. And that is how most people are going to try and break the Sash. But as we've already said, you've got Scramble Switch, you can put him on the bench, and then you can heal him, and we'll talk about some healing cards in a little bit. So if your opponent tries to get round this by 2-hit KOing Regirock, that's fine, you've got time to heal. The way which really hurts, however, is using abilities. So there are a few cards which will really hurt Regirock. Now this would involve something like a Greninja from X and Y or the Break, or indeed Ariados, or indeed using Crobat and Golbat. All of these are ways to put damage counters down, or poison in the case of Ariados, using abilities, and it will break Focus Sash. Your opponent has an Ariados on the bench, they hit you for 100 damage or more, you go down to 10 HP, Ariados has poisoned you with his ability, you get KO'd. That is not good. Your opponent can drop a Golbat or a Crobat, put 2 or 3 damage counters on Regirock, you no longer have full HP, then your opponent can KO you. And the same thing with Greninja or Greninja Break. The other thing that can be a pain is decks that continually spread damage, especially with damage counters. Now, if they try and spread damage with bench damage, you can just use something like a Mr. Mime, for instance. Although make sure you use the Psychic Mr. Mime, not the almost identical Fairy Mr. Mime. Because when Wobbuffet's in the active, he will block the ability of the Fairy Mr. Mime, he will not block the ability of the Psychic Mr. Mime. In most decks it makes no difference, in this one you've got to use the Psychic Mr. Mime. But something like a Trevenant Break, for instance, 30 damage on each of your Pokemon every turn. It's damage counters, so it gets through something like a Mr. Mime, and it's so much bench damage that it is going to overwhelm your ability to heal. So that's the way your opponent breaks Sash. But that's it, ladies and gentlemen. And that's a pretty short list. I should also add in cards like Excelgor. Excelgor will annoyingly do 100 damage because of Regirock's weakness to grass. And then Poison will kick in and KO him. But unless they're playing something like Excelgor or Trevenant, or they're playing one of these ability cards like Crobat, like Golbat, like Ariados, etc., it's very difficult to KO. One more example I'll give you is Mega Mewtwo, or regular Mewtwo I suppose, who's got the damage change ability, attack, which allows you to swap damage counters, so you can put enough damage counters on Regirock to KO. Although Regirock then just does 100 damage or less and then doesn't get KO'd. So Mewtwo's not a great counter. Plus no one's playing that in Expanded. So quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, it's a really good deck because your opponent can't use all those traditional ways like lasers, Zorosic, etc. to break Sash. And outside of that, there are very few ways to break the Focus Sash of a fighting Pokemon with this Omega Barrier. And the fact that it's basic means you will always have that Omega Barrier ancient trait. Something like a Primal Groudon is always going to have at least one turn before it can Primal Evolve, which means there's a turn where they can get rid of energy, Lysander at active, etc. So, we've said that if your opponent tries to 2-hit KO, that is going to stop you being able to use Focus Sash. So, there is some healing that we need to do, and we've got some pretty good cards we can use to heal. We've got Pokemon Center Lady. It heals 60 damage and removes all special conditions, which can be useful, although you'll rarely be affected by special conditions. But it's there if you are. Heals 60 damage, that's pretty gosh darn good. You can also heal 60 damage using Super Potion, but you have to discard an energy to do so. Not the end of the world, but it does mean that sometimes you have to put 5 energy onto Regirock, which can be a bit of a pain, but if you need to, you need to. The other thing you can do, of course, is use Super Potion to heal a Regirock who's got no energy attached to him. Because then you can't discard the energy. Heal, go to discard, there's no energy there, gutted. Couple other cards which are lesser played, Cassius. Allows you to shuffle one of your Pokemon and all cards attached to it into your deck. Now, one of the matches I had at the tournament where I went undefeated in Swiss, I actually had to, 3 turns in a row, use Cassius to shuffle a Regirock and a Focus Sash back into my deck, just to stall long enough to get 4 energy onto a Regirock. Inconvenient, but doable. The other healing card I would recommend, and it's not a card I've seen played in any other deck, is Olympia. Now this is a Little Scene supporter from the Generation set, which acts as a switch, but the card that switched out of the active, you heal 30 damage. So Regirock takes a hit, you play Olympia, heal 30 damage, and then while you're on the bench you can play stuff like a Pokemon Center Lady, Super Potion, etc. The thing you've got to remember is, if you switch a Regirock to the bench, who's only got 10 HP remaining, then something like, one of the most common examples would be a Darkrai from Dark Explorers, could come in, hit him for 30 on the bench and get the KO. That is absolutely something that can happen. So, let's have a look at the matchups. By the way, there are other healing cards. I've given you what I consider to be the best. You can play something like Freshwater Set if you really like. I believe the ones I've given you here are the best ones in this deck. If you want to disagree and try some others, I will not hate you for that. So, let's start with a negative first. Get it out of the way. There are some auto losses. Some decks that you're just not going to beat. So let's go through a few of them nice and quickly. Trevenant Break. 30 damage to all of the bench, and it plays Bursting Balloon, so you take 60 damage. You aren't beating Trevenant Break. They spread too much damage too quickly. You don't heal that much. It's all over. Game over, man. Game over. Anything that plays Ariados can just use the ability to go through Sash. You will lose that game every time. Anything that plays Bats can just drop 20 or 30 damage before they get the hit. You get knocked out. And Greninja. Anything that play, these Greninja decks of XY Greninja and Greninja Break, you aren't beating those decks, ladies and gentlemen. It's not happening. They can just drop damage counters. Now, for all of those other than Trevenant, yes, you can play something like Hex Maniac, for instance. Don't play Garbodor. It defeats the object of your deck. It will get Lysandered in the active and KO'd. It will give your opponent a prize. It's not the deck you want to. It's not the card you want to play. You can play Hex Maniac and you can try and chain Hex Maniacs, but it's going to be very difficult because you're going to be wanting to play stuff like Pokemon Center Lady and Lysander, and the Hex Maniac is going to be a pain. Although you can play it if you're worried about abilities. It's possible. But in Expanded, Greninja's not so good. And Bats decks aren't so good, and Ariados isn't so good. And I know in the US, Trevenant's having a bit of play, but over here in the UK, we are seeing that Dark decks are the best in Expanded, which has completely removed Trevenant from the format, making it not an issue. And here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. I've just run you through the bad matchups, but unless your opponent has one of those ways to get through Sash, everything else is a win if you set up. And that is a big if, because you've got to get those 4 energy down and you've got to play it, and it can be a very difficult deck to play. And you've got to go ahead and make sure that you're always going to the bench, that you're healing enough, that you're playing Scramble Switch. It's a very disciplined deck. You've got to, sometimes you'll have a Sycamore that you want to play, but you just have to sit there and spend the next 2 turns attaching energy because you can't afford to Sycamore the energy. But if you play it right and you draw okay, and that's always a big if in this game, you will win. Let's go for some examples. Mega Rayquaza. Ooh, 220 HP. Ooh, fighting resistance. Well, let's say you've got 2 strong energy, which you usually will have on a Regirock. Well, you're doing 100 damage. 80 plus 40 for the strong, minus 20 for resistance. So you do 100 damage, which means over 2 turns, you need to hit 1 out of 2 heads to get a KO on a Mega Rayquaza. And generally, Mega Rayquaza decks have no way to break Focus Sash. So you hit them for 100 or 140 if you can hit the heads. They don't KO you. You scramble switch and get the KO. And these Rayquaza decks generally play a lot of Shaman. Well, that's alright, because you can go ahead, grab those Shaman off the bench, and you can usually one-hit KO them. You'll be generally playing either Magnetic Storm to get rid of weakness, or you'll be playing Fighting Stadium. That down with a single strong energy, 2 strong energy, and you will get the KO on a Shaman. Not to mention, of course, that half your starters are Wobbuffet, and these Rayquaza decks really rely on playing lots of Shaman, so if you start Wobbuffet, you will often slow them down enough. It's a really good matchup. Night March. Well, okay, Night March are going to KO a couple of Wobbuffet. That's a pain. But you can feed them a few Robo-Subs, so they're not getting a prize, and then they hit you. Generally, they'll do enough to get a KO, and you'll lose the Focus Sash, and then you put in a new one. I played a Night March over the weekend, and they had enough damage and enough energy to get a KO on a Regirock every single turn. And I won the match 2-0. And the reason is, it didn't matter what my opponent did. And this is what happens with Regirock. It didn't matter that my opponent could have had a KO every turn. It was completely irrelevant, because every turn, I either had a Robo-Sub, or I had a Regigigas, Regigigas, I love Regigigas, but I'm talking Regirock. Or I had a Regirock with a Focus Sash. So my opponent couldn't take a prize. They would do enough damage and enough attacks to get 12, 13 knockouts, and they'd get maybe 4 or 5. Because in the late game, what you can actually do is let them KO a Regirock, because by then you've had enough time to put 4 energy on a new Regirock. But by then, maybe they've KO'd 2 Wobbuffets, 3 Robo-Subs, broken 2 Sashes, and then got on the KO on the Regirock. So they've had to do something along the lines of 7, 8, 9 attacks, and they've gotten 3 prizes. I'm okay with that. Let's say something like Yveltal. Ooh, Yveltal resists fighting. What I'm going to say about Yveltal is basically the same as I've just said about Rayquaza. Because with a Fighting Fury bout, Yveltal EX has 210 HP and fighting resistance. You win in the same way you do against Rayquaza, although they are less susceptible to the Wobbuffet lock. Now, Dark decks as a whole, obviously Darkrai is weak to fighting, so that's good for you. Now, Dark decks can present a little bit of a problem. Darkrai from Dark Explorers does 30 damage to the bench with his attack. So if you're not playing a Mr. Mime, and if you are, they're just going to use Lysander to drag it into the active and KO it and take a prize. If you're not playing Mr. Mime, then they're constantly doing 30 damage to your Regirock. They are going to be going nice and early, so they're going to be constantly dropping 30 damage. But between your Pokemon Center Lady, your Olympia, your Super Potion, you should be able to throw up an undamaged Regirock, one-hit KO the Darkrai, and then your 2 prizes up. Let's take one more example. Raikou Eels. Well, firstly, everything there is weak to fighting, so you're going to get a whole bunch of KOs. Also, they've got no way to break the Sash. Now, there is one trick that Raikou Eels has, and that is Jolteon EX. He attacks, and then you cannot attack them with a basic Pokemon. And, of course, you're only playing basic Pokemon. But there's 2 ways to get over this. First of all, unless they get it going nice and early, you just Lysander it up and KO it. Even if they do get it going, you don't play Switch, you play Escape Rope. You play Escape Rope to put Jolteon onto the bench. You then immediately play a Lysander to bring it active. All the effects have disappeared because it's gone to the bench, and then you can just KO it. I played a Raikou Eels at the weekend. They got a Jolteon going. I just played Escape Rope and Lysander and KO'd it, and that was that. And this is what I mean. there are a lot of auto losses for Regirock. Not a lot, that's a lie. There are a few. Decks like I've said, Greninja, Trevenant, etc. Yes, you will lose to them. But how many of those decks are you really going to play in one tournament in Expanded? Not many, ladies and gentlemen. And almost every other deck just can't break Focus Sash. And then it becomes essentially like a game of solitaire. It doesn't matter what your opponent does. The only thing that matters is, can you get your Regirock set up and constantly heal or scramble switch, or even just go to the bench and stall for a couple of turns while you build up a new Regirock? Because if you can, you are going to win the game regardless of what your opponent does. And going back to Regirock's attack, time you get a couple of fighting strong energy on there, actually, it ain't that bad. You're generally one-hit KOing non-EXs, even Baby Evil Towels, you just need to hit a coin flip to get the one-hit KO. And you're generally two-hit KOing EXs. With enough strong energy, you can actually get a one-hit KO if you flip a heads. So, let's say something like a Seismitoad, 2 strong energy and a coin flip on a heads, and you're actually doing 180 damage. Wait, did I say 2? I meant 3 strong energy. 80 plus 3 strong is 140, plus the coin flip is 180. Or 2 strong, a coin flip, and a fighting stadium, for instance, would be 180. I think I got the maths right on that. If not, I'll just put a correction up on the screen. Point is, it's a very, very strong deck. Yeah, there's some bad matchups, but if you don't play a bad matchup, almost everything else is a good matchup. It takes a lot of patience to play the deck. Oftentimes, you'll draw, attach an energy, and pass. You'll be using cards like Corinna to just grab a Regirock and a Robo-Sub, attach an energy, pass. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen? It is a very, very strong deck indeed. Now, I hope I have sufficiently explained this Regirock deck to you lovely people. If I have not, then pop some comments down, put some questions down in the comment section, and I will get to you shortly. People have seemed to like these kind of videos, like I said, the Greninja one. So if you like these kind of videos, let me know in the comments. Click that like button. I'll give you a second. Thank you for clicking the like button. And if you didn't click the like button, I just thank you for doing something you didn't do. And you should feel like a very bad person indeed. But you can fix it. Just click the like button. It takes but a second. And of course, make sure you subscribe if you haven't, and get a friend to subscribe on your behalf if you have. If you want to see the deck in action, I recorded my round 3 game against a very good Worlds player. That will be online very shortly. And yes, you can have the deck list, but it's coming in a separate video later on. Deck list videos can be quite bad for some players because you look at the deck list and you don't understand the deck. I think these videos are good for explaining how the deck works. And I've had a lot of feedback from people to that degree. So, if you want a list, hang on. I will put the video of me playing it in the comments. I shall put the deck list video when it's made in the comments. And I think that's about it. As always, ladies and gentlemen, look after yourselves till next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.